Pay attention to fools and foolishness. Some of the times, very smart guys can do foolish things. So it's important to pay attention to this. Is it correct that the work that we do, that the worth of the work that we do, can only be measured by accelerated profits? And ask ourselves that question. And what does that mean we do with it? In healthcare, for example, we talk about orphan diseases. You all have heard the term orphan diseases? Orphan diseases, they usually talk about a disease that doesn't have enough people to really spend a lot of money working on developing a cure or treatment for that disease. There's a disease called dysautonomia. Over 500,000 people in the country have it in the United States, but it's an orphan disease. So we have to ask ourselves, is the idea of commercializing our work the only measure of our success? Now, it's really interesting because I also wrote this little statement down here about healthcare as a for-profit business. Right now, people are discussing what are we going to do with healthcare in this country. But sometimes we don't spend the time asking, does it really make sense that people should pool their money and resources so that folks can send money out of the insurance pool, and it's not the healing of the patient that's central? I'm a physician. My only responsibility should be healing my patient. I shouldn't be concerned, I have to be concerned with whether my patient can pay for it, whether we can afford it, those kind of things. But not to the extent that all the money that's put in this pool has been sent out to somebody else who has no responsibility within the community. Maybe we need to rethink the way that we look at different kinds of businesses. I bring this up because, again, we measure our lives by businesses now. I sit on some board of directors of corporations. I have my own business, right? And I want it to do well, but we have to ask ourselves the questions as to what is our final goal. There's another term that comes around these days. People talk about globalization, right? You know what globalization is? I wasn't really sure what it was, but I know that it's not new. Globalization isn't new because porcelain from China is seen on the shores of East Africa from 1,000 or 500 years ago. You even see it in South America. When we look at the cultures around Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia, that was sort of a globalization in international trade. Slaves in the New World is the reason why the United States and Brazil's populations look so much alike. Right? It's not a nice globalization, but it was there. Globalization isn't new. What is different is our greater capacity to transport things from one place to another. Again, we have to ask ourselves, why do we use terms and accept things as revelations? When I think of globalization, I want you to consider it two different ways. I'm bringing this up because science is globalized, right? And we talk about using science to change things. Globalization may be the idea of the homogenization of all markets to make it easier for corporations to sell services and goods worldwide. Or globalization could be the capacity of companies and businesses to supply their unique products and services around the world in order to fulfill the need of individuals, people, cultures, and societies and nations worldwide. They sound alike, but they're two different things. There's a difference, and that definition is critically important. In one area, we work to change people, governments, businesses in consideration of selling first, regardless of the desires and the circumstances and needs of a given society. The goal is to make it easier and more consistent to maximize profit. And in the second instance, we're facilitating the capacity and the logistics of societies and various countries to obtain the products, goods, and services to help them achieve their goals for their future. One is people-centric, the other is corporate-centric. It's important for us to pay attention to these things because sometimes people rattle these things off very glibly, and as we're sitting in our labs and we're working on our projects, we go along with that. We have a responsibility. You know, is the role of science changing and evolving? You know, sometimes they say, well, you just sort of sit in your corner and you work on your little thing. I'm struck by the idea that people used to think of science as really broad. You know, there was a scientist, they knew a little bit about a lot of things, or even they may know in depth about stuff, but they knew about the world of physical sciences. But I think it's still possible. Even though we have a lot more depth in some areas, science today is more transdisciplinary than ever before. It's transdisciplinary. It means that you need to know about a lot of different things. You know, when we got to molecular biology, it's because there's so many things that are going on with chemistry and stuff like that that's in the cells. But it doesn't just stop there, because we start looking at genetic expression and all kinds of things. You need to understand the impact of the sciences and the work that you do will be felt around the world, whether you're intended to or not. And there's one other danger with this as we start to look through. There's some sort of sayings that people have, you know. As we go into the future, if we don't make these choices, if we don't think about things, we may never have known that the world could have been different. We may never have known that the world could be different. You know, people always say things like, well, you know, it's okay because that's the way it was meant to be. You heard that before? That's the way it was meant to be. Our everything will work out for the best. Right? When something goes wrong, we say, oh, it'll work out for the best. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but no, it won't, unless one has exceptionally good karma. It requires us to make a decision. We take a particular problem, we work on it, we glibly assume everything will be all right. We have this idea that we can tinker with things, but we really don't know how the pieces really fit together. And as we get into the sciences that we're involved in this day, the things that you guys will be really the bearers of, that you will decide what we need to do. When we get into the nanoscale in our machines and our interventions, when we start to do genetic manipulations, the potential to impact life much more grossly on a macro scale across species and ecosystems, it increases geometrically. It's important to realize that. It might be just your research project and you're thinking of it and this is really great and somebody comes along and commercialize it, but these things will happen. So I have a couple of questions I want you to think of as life scientists. One of the problems that we have, one of the questions or the dilemmas I want to ask yourself about is mistaking the significance and the impact of genetics, phenotypes, and nurture. Genetics, phenotype, and nurture. And making excuses, allowing us to excuse societal issues as it's just genetic. Right? So nowadays, we're looking at personalized medicine. All of these things are really good, but you can't take them necessarily to extreme. They have to be balanced with other things. So while we know that a certain genotype may set you up for more susceptibility for a given disease, how much of that susceptibility is influenced by the environment? We just have to think about those things. Don't excuse societal behavior just by saying, oh, well, that person it was genetic, it was going to happen anyway. No, it probably wasn't. Because the environment about social issues can affect things as well. We also need to know when to intervene and when not to. These days, I was struck by how much the whole idea of genetically modified organisms is around. When I believe I was in college or just getting out of college when the first genetically modified organism, maybe it was a little bit later than that, was let out. And it had to do with a bacteria that was on the surface of strawberries to allow them to be phos-free. Now I ask myself the question, is that worth exposing an ecosystem to have strawberries year-round? No, I think it's a valid question. And that's one that we have to ask ourselves. When we look at farming and agriculture, we have to understand that in the years past, some of our issues with farming and agriculture came about because there was only one type of potato being grown in Ireland that was subject to a certain kind of disease. So, we have to pay attention to these things. We have to be sure that we're not encouraging unreasonable detrimental behavior with workarounds. So I was at a conference yesterday on diabetes technology, and they started talking about food and nutrition. And so they started talking about allowing people after they got type 2 diabetes to continue to eat the kind of things that they want, but make them okay. Wait a minute, that's the reason you got diabetes. I'm bringing these up, and maybe I'm making them a little bit of a hyperbole with them, but think about it. We're talking about continuing to encourage people to have the same behavior that caused them to have problems so that they can pass that behavior on to their children and the rest of the family and society. But what we're going to do is we're going to add, now we're going to go and do Stibby